guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today I am going to be doing my December wrap-up, chatting through the last few books I read in the year 2021. I was actually able to complete a total of 7 books in December, which I would say I am pretty pleased with. I definitely oscillated between reading books that emotionally destroyed me in every way, shape, and form, and then lighter reads that I hoped would kind of pull me out of that emotional black hole I was in, caused by many of the reads I'm going to be chatting about today. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the books themselves. The first book I was able to complete for the month of December made my top books of the year video, and that is Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee. This is the third and final book to the Greenbone saga and also one of my most anticipated fantasy releases for 2021. So obviously I picked it up right at the beginning of the month, flew through it, vlogged my entire experience of reading it. It definitely screwed me up. But wow, this book was also an incredible concluding novel to a trilogy and just absolutely tied a bow on everything I love about this series, and also just makes me so excited for future books that Fonda Lee is going to be putting out, both in this world, as I know she's working on some short story collections, but also just new fantasy releases by her because she has just impeccable writing. But if you are for some reason not familiar, the Greenbone saga is an Asian-inspired urban fantasy story set in the fictional island of Kekon. And in this place, a very powerful substance resides, and that is called jade. Certain individuals in this world can wear jade, and it basically makes them stronger, faster, and all of those things. And the production and the supply of jade is controlled by 2 very powerful crime families. Within this series, you follow a variety of perspectives from one single crime family, and you basically follow them in the ups and many downs of this sort of turf war that is existing between them and the Mountain Clan, their greatest rival. This is a series that takes you not only through so many ups and downs, and you see it from so many different angles through all of these different perspectives, but we also cover huge swaths of time. Fonda Lee is able to craft an absolutely fascinating world kind of centering with these crime families. Obviously, there are some underground activities associated with them, but they're also both so hugely economically powerful. They control the strings from behind the scenes from a political and global economic perspective, and you start to see their conflict kind of escalate in so many different avenues and ways that just makes it so exciting to read. As I mentioned, this story takes place over large swaths of time, and that is definitely escalated quite a bit within this third book. I was not anticipating to see so much time pass throughout this particular story, but using this, I feel like Fonda Lee was not only able to give space to the conflict to kind of escalate in a logical and in a very intense fashion, but we were also able to see completed character arcs and kind of the passing of the baton between one generation to another. So much has changed within this world from the very first book, Jade City. We see things like globalization, escalation of foreign interests within a specific place. We also see perspectives of individuals who are refugees from Kekon kind of residing in new locations and bringing their culture with them. All of this is played on the backdrop of family connection and the desire for wealth and power. So many of the characters you will just fall in love with, and kind of seeing their growth from books 1 to book 3 is amazing. I also just love the different types of escalation we got. Obviously, there is a lot of combat, and Fonda Lee does a fantastic job writing that, but beyond that, there's also kind of boardroom-based conflict as well that can be fascinating in its own way. The characters themselves is really where this story shines. You just feel so connected, and there's just a level of intensity that keeps you flipping the pages. Fonda Lee does not hold any punches in this third and final installment. I loved every second of it, despite the fact that it destroyed me in every way, shape, and form. I'm happy to say that the third book in the Greenbone saga was just as excellent as the first 2 installments. Again, I could not speak more highly about this trilogy, this author, her writing. It's just genius, fascinating, entertaining, all of the above. One of my all-time favorite fantasy series. I'm so happy to say it finished off very strongly, and I gave this book a 4.5 5 stars. Speaking of destroying myself emotionally, from there I also read The Fool's Fate by Robin Hobb this month. I don't even know where to begin with this book. If you've read this trilogy, you know the literal and emotional journey that Robin Hobb takes you on with this final novel within the trilogy, and I'm still processing it all this time later. I mean, here's the deal. This is the 9th book of Robin Hobb's I have read, and I have grown so attached to so many characters, but specifically Fool and Fitz, obviously. So seeing the culmination of their story and their journey within this third novel was devastating, but so beautiful and so well done. Like, I'm trying to not like tear up while talking about it. Just the connection I felt to this particular book is just truly unparalleled and is a very unique reading experience that I've only had a few times in my life. This is a trilogy where we find ourselves once again within Fitz's life. It takes place quite a few years after the events of the Farseer trilogy, and a large part of this book is seeing Fitz kind of get re-involved within Farseer politics. He had separated himself from after the events of the original first 3 books. This is a book very much about Fitz's individual journey, not only as he's confronting a lot of his personal choices and personal demons throughout his life, but also kind of allowing himself to open up to love and friendship once again, also confronting many aspects of his own personal trauma as being the chosen one within a fantasy trilogy. This is also a book where we're introduced to a lot of new characters, kind of the next generation of this world, which I personally really enjoyed. And we also find ourselves in the middle of a very complicated political plot, kind of involving a tenuous marriage alliance, as well as the conflict between different magic users in the realm. In this world, there are 2 types of magic. There's the skill, which is very rare and also very much idealized as it's associated with the crown, but there's also something called the wit, which is an animal-based magic that has been highly demonized within society. Our main character Fitz is a user of both, and throughout this trilogy we see wit users fighting for their right to not only use their magic but be accepted within society at large. I fell headfirst into reading this third novel right away. I would say especially within the second book within this trilogy, a lot of what we had read before was a lot of world building and setup for the events of this third and final story. This had a very classic quest at its core, but in it we also got so many of our questions answered and kind of seeing the culmination of a lot of the different politics and drama that we've been following along for the first 2 books. And obviously the conflict and the politics that surrounded this very important quest that we followed through the majority of the story was fantastic, but I would say the most important aspect of the story and the true shining heart of this book was seeing the relationship between the Fitz and the Fool. There's so much I want to say about them, but I also feel like words are simply not enough. You followed them through so many different books, and I do feel like so much of their relationship was confronted within this story in an incredibly painful but such a beautiful way. Their relationship is one of the most unique as well as just patiently built story arcs that I've ever encountered in any book series. I have not felt more for a pair within a fantasy setting than I have for the Fitz and the Fool. Just the journey they've gone on together, just their emotional acceptance of one another. How far they will go for each other is just a thing of stunning beauty. And I don't even know what else to say except that I loved this book so much. I sobbed reading this book. I laughed reading this book. I also just really enjoyed seeing more of the Farseer politics, but honestly, the Fitz and the Fool for life. I don't know how I'm gonna carry on now that I finished this particular book. It was superb. 5 out of 5 stars. Robin Hobb just destroys me over and over again. After completing both Jade Legacy and The Fool's Fate, I needed a bit of a lighter read to kind of pull me out of the emotional state I was in. So first and foremost, I picked up Written and Read by Anne Bishop. This was actually a reread for me, and it's a urban fantasy sort of serialized fiction story, and it does have the beginnings of what I think will be a very will they won't they, hate to love style romance. And this is set in honestly a very fascinating urban fantasy world. In this world, humanity exists, but so does a set of creatures called the Others, and these supernatural creatures are made up of what you would expect from werewolves to elementals to vampires, and they have existed on this planet for as long as humanity has, and they have been at odds with each other since the beginning of time. They've kind of reached a point where they have tenuous peace, and basically the Others control all of the natural resources within this world, and humanity kind of keeps itself to their central cities and provides the others with technological advancements. They don't often deal with each other very much. They have their own governments and they kind of have their own laws in place where they try to prevent conflict between one another. But within every major human city, there's something called an others courtyard, which is a huge swath of land where a variety of others can live and work. And this also allows for some minor connection between the others and humans. This book opens on our main character Meg fleeing a compound that she has been kept her entire life, and she's been kept there because she is a blood prophet, meaning her skin is kind of sold to the highest bidder, because when she is cut, she does see glimpses of the future, and this is sold for a very high price. To ensure that she doesn't get captured, she decides to escape to the others compound and apply as a job as a human liaison and work there. She does this because human law does not apply on the others compound, and basically her previous benefactors will not be able to reach her there. Her job as a human liaison is pretty simple. She basically just sorts and sends out the mail within the courtyard itself. This book is really charming for its own ways. I would say it's definitely a very slow read. Much of this book is really getting to know our main character Meg, and also as she begins to become friends with a variety of members within the courtyard itself. Meg is an interesting main character because she is incredibly naive but kind. Normally this particular setup would annoy me, but her naivety makes sense given that she has been in a compound her entire life and what she has been taught about the world has been very controlled and restricted. So it makes sense that there are so many things that she has never encountered before and has to learn, and also it makes sense that she would have a different approach to many things in life because she hasn't really been introduced to many prejudices or even just knowledge about how humans and others are supposed to interact. Another main character within this story is Simon Wolfgard, and he is a werewolf and kind of one of the more important figures within the courtyard himself. He is very suspicious of his new human liaison Meg because he fears that she is hiding a secret, which she is, because she has not told anyone that she is a blood prophet. Soon the story does begin to escalate as people surrounding Meg's past do try to come and capture her back, but a lot of the story is really just Meg kind of finding a new place in this courtyard, and obviously there are many books in this series, so a lot of the first one was kind of establishing the world and watching Meg make friends and kind of introducing the possible concept of a romance between her and Simon. Overall, I found this book to be a really easy read. I actually found the world building around the others to be very fascinating. I really liked that they are incredibly separate from humanity and also just an entirely different species, and therefore would react differently than humanity would. And I also really appreciated that the author kind of stayed true to those supernatural creatures and how they would kind of react in different situations, obviously as devised by her. It's interesting because I would say this book kind of sits somewhere in the middle between like supernatural fantasy, possible romance, and like a slice of life story, because a lot of the book is just Meg going about her day, sorting the mail, and kind of becoming nestled in the hearts of everyone within the courtyard. I liked it. I found it to be an easy read. It did not blow my mind, but I'm very much looking forward to reading future books within this world. And I do think the supernatural component of this was very interesting. I would give this first one like a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I wouldn't pick it up if you're looking for something like with heavy romance on the onslaught, because that is not there. This is for sure going to be a slow burn, but I kind of appreciate that too, given that there are so many books. It kind of keeps you coming back for more, you know what I mean? The next book I read this month was a historical romance, and that was A Portrait of a Scotsman by Evie Dunmore. This is the third book in A League of Extraordinary Women. I read the first one, Bringing Down the Duke, a few years ago and absolutely loved it. So I was very much looking forward to picking this one up. Unfortunately, I would say that I didn't love this book as much as I was hoping, and it kind of fell a little bit flat for me. That being said, it was still highly entertaining, and I would say if the elements I personally didn't like still call out to you, still pick it up, check it out for yourself. I feel like with romances, a lot of it can just depend on what your personal preferences are. This follows our main character, Hattie, and she is the daughter of a very powerful banking family. And she's also part of one of the first groups of women to attend Oxford, and that's kind of the connection between all of these stories, as each book kind of follows a different woman from the Oxford scholar group. And she herself is studying to be an artist, and she also has a very romanticized, view of the world and what kind of husband she would love to have. Unfortunately, what she dreams of having and what she ends up getting are very, very different, as she, at the beginning of this book, marries a man named Lucian Blackstone, who actually is kind of the arch rival to her family's business, and he himself also created a scenario which would force Hattie's family's hand and result in them getting married to save her reputation. So begins this book of two opposites kind of hating each other but sort of growing to love each other throughout this book and story. First and foremost, I found the first 150 pages to be very entertaining, obviously very dramatic, and how they resulted in getting married. Hattie, for the most part, I did enjoy as a main character. She was a little naive and a little whiny, but there was quite a bit of a character arc that we kind of followed her on, which I appreciated. Lucian Blackstone is the classic grumpy, brooding, dangerous appearing new money type of character you tend to run into in these historical fiction stories. Ultimately, I would say this story did fall a bit flat for me. First and foremost, I found the pacing to be a bit off. There was also a lot of discussion about kind of the economic reality of the Industrial Revolution and sort of its impact on the working class, which I sort of appreciated that insight, and also as well as the author's desire to sort of confront this really dark and harrowing reality for many people during this time. But it felt a little flimsy and a little bit like a backdrop for a romance to play out in front of, if that makes sense. I also found that the really dramatic will this break them apart moment that you often find near the end of romance stories to be a little bit predictable and expected. But I will say there is an element of the epilogue of this book that I wish the author swapped in for the primary conflict instead, as I think that would have made a much more interesting and unique exploration, especially given the time period and the characters. Overall, I liked this story. I didn't love it. It isn't my favorite book that Evie Dunmore has put out, but if you like historical romance, I would say this is still a good book to check out, especially if those particular tropes call out to you. In the end, I gave this book a 2.5, 2.75 out of 5 stars. The next book I was able to complete was another reread, and that is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I loved this book, and this book also destroyed me in every way, shape, and form. I remember loving it when I read this book the first time around, but you just never know how well a book is going to hold up when you revisit it. But honestly, I think I love this book even more than the first time I read it, from the writing to the characters to the story and just the emotional weight of it all. I honestly feel like this is one of the best YA fantasy books I've ever read, and I will shout about it from the rooftops for the rest of time. But this is a dual perspective YA fantasy story that first follows one of our main characters, Laszlo Strange. He, at the beginning of the story, is a librarian, and he would say he is pretty happy with his life. He loves books, he loves stories, and most of all, he loves to dedicate all of his time in researching a lost place, the city of Weep. He distinctly remembers the day when magic struck and basically wiped the memory of this place from the minds of everyone around him, kind of moving its history into a place of legend. Laszlo spends all of his free time researching old texts in hopes of unlocking the secret of this place, and his dream really comes true when one day an envoy arrives from the city of Weep itself, kind of recruiting different specialists in a variety of fields to help them kind of solve this unknown situation. When Laszlo arrives in the city of Weep, not only do we encounter this huge monumental problem that Laszlo himself is going to help to solve, we also begin to learn more about the history of this place, as well as the pain and the suffering and sort of the generational trauma that presides here. This book is stunning from truly beginning to end. The writing style, just the quality of Laini Taylor's words are just breathtaking. It'll sweep you away. But more than that, the story following Laszlo and our other main character is just beautiful, not only their relationship but also their individual lives, as both of them have to overcome so much to just live. And learning more about the city itself and just the history of this specific place will just break your heart into a million pieces. It's also such a complicated situation, and I think that is what Laini Taylor does such a great job imparting on us as a reader. You read this and you just see so much pain and so much suffering, but also so much desire to move on, but it's so hard to let that pain go and not hurt someone else around you. This is just a stunning book of hopes and dreams and history and a place, and it will just absolutely capture you, I assure you. I personally cannot wait to read book 2. I hope to do it early this year because just Strange the Dreamer was such a stunning book. It almost made my top books of the year. It was really hard to keep it off. But I gave this book 5 stars. Just truly one of the best YA books I've read in a while. Officially in the home stretch, I only have 2 more books to talk about. The first is The Way Back by Gabrielle Savage. I read this book in under 24 hours during a 24-hour readathon vlog, and I really enjoyed it. I actually saved this book from July with the hopes to read it in December, and I'm really glad I did because honestly this felt like a perfect winter read. From the ambiance to the writing to the story itself, it was just absolutely transporting. This is a story inspired by Jewish folklore and is set in a small Eastern European village some point in the mid-1800s. We follow 2 children as they basically encounter death in 2 different ways, and we follow them as they begin a solo journey in a place called the Far Country. In this reality, demons live amongst humans, but they also have their own world called the Far Country itself, and here demonic lords and ladies kind of rule, and any piece of humanity here is very high currency. So once these 2 children kind of venture out into the Far Country, they quickly become important tokens, very powerful fallen angels and demons. And from there, they themselves go on their own perilous journey, but also link up in a very unexpected turn of events and fight for their way back home. This is a book that I really enjoyed. First and foremost, I really loved the Jewish folklore component. I wouldn't say I'm very well versed in any religious folklore at all, but I honestly found these stories to be so interesting, and I also really loved how death itself was personified. I feel like that as a literary device is one of my favorites to encounter. I would also say our 2 main characters are on the cusp of adulthood, and their individual journeys are very much, I would say, parallel to a coming of age tale. Obviously the obstacles and all of the things they have to overcome were almost unbelievable in many different ways, but they also kind of confronted so many different elements of themselves, and it was truly a beautiful thing to see. I also really enjoyed how the story itself was told. The writing style was fantastic, which was something I expected going in. I just really enjoy Gabrielle Savage's ability to write kind of a modern day winding fairy tale, and it was truly breathtaking. But more than that, structurally, I would say the first 50% of this book is rather chaotic. You, just like the characters, are kind of thrown into this very unknown situation, and I felt I was constantly just trying to find my bearings and also try to figure out what in the world was going on. I personally enjoyed this element to the story. I found it to be a really unexpected kind of experience, but I would definitely say there is a shift that occurs about halfway through this book, and the nature of the story itself also transformed. Watch as our main characters kind of take the agency back of not only the story itself but also of their lives, and I felt like that was really played out so successfully. From the writing to the characters and the wintry setting, I honestly just felt like this was a perfect winter read and would highly recommend it, especially if you love sort of folklore fairy tale style stories. In the end, I would give this book about a 3.75 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. And the very last book I read in the month of December is another sort of reimagining of a well-known story, and that is The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nevo. This is a queer and magical retelling of The Great Gatsby and also centers a Vietnamese adoptee and Jordan Baker at this story. I loved the change of narration to Jordan Baker being our main character. I just felt like this was such an interesting shift in point of view. Jordan Baker in the original Great Gatsby seems to be this sort of flippant modern woman who does not want to settle down and also toys with men's emotions as she sees fit. In this particular reimagining of the story, she is still all of those things, but she's also actually queer, so she's toying with men and women's emotions, but I also feel like the perspective and interpretation of this desire is completely flipped on its head. Jordan Baker herself completely realizes that she's living existence, but she's able to do this and fully claims that she's able to do this due to her wealth and standing, and if other women have the opportunity to, they would definitely seize it as well. And also, as Jordan is a Vietnamese adoptee. She has always been othered her entire life by her new adoptive family from her friends that she grew up around. So with this in mind, she has decided that she is not going to conform to anyone's expectations of her and simply live for herself. And I just feel like that shift in main character and also kind of having a woman's point of view centered within the Great Gatsby story, I just felt like brought this particular book to a new and interesting place. Other added component, of course, is the magical component. And I do feel like the dazzle that the magical component added to the story was fun. I wouldn't say this is like a heavily fantasy book, but I do feel like it added to the overall ambiance of the setting and tale. Those changes aside, I would say this is a pretty direct retelling of The Great Gatsby. If anything, it also kind of escalates the love triangle between Daisy and Gatsby to be like a love pentagon between Jordan, Daisy, Gatsby, and Nick. For that reason, I would say it was kind of an expected story because I did know where it was going, and I wouldn't say it deviated so much from the original text, but I do feel like the additions and the slight changes the author made were very successful, and I loved the dreamlike quality of the writing itself, but I do feel like it dragged a bit in the middle given that a lot of the plot was so well known. All in all, I would say if you love The Great Gatsby, this is for sure a fantastic book to pick up. I found it to be a beautiful retelling of a well-known tale, and I also feel like it kind of brought the story itself to some new and interesting places. And with that in mind, I would give this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Alrighty guys, those are all the books I read in the month of December. Let me know down below some books you've read recently, as I would love to know, and I will see you guys soon with another video soon. Goodbye!